It started with something so small, so insignificant, that I almost laughed at how it all unraveled. A forgotten phone. A simple mistake. Hannah had always been meticulous. She wasn't the type to leave things lying around, let alone something as personal as her phone. But that morning, in the rush of getting the kids ready for school, she left it behind on the kitchen counter. I didn't notice it at first. I was too focused on packing lunches and making sure everyone got out the door on time. But as I walked back inside, ready to head to work, the buzzing caught my attention. Hannah's phone lit up with a message. No name. Just a number. I had a great time last night. Can't stop thinking about you. I froze. At first, I thought I was reading it wrong. Maybe it was a spam text, or one of those automated messages. But something about it felt too personal. Too specific. The phone buzzed again. When can I see you again? I miss your laugh. I set the lunch bag down carefully, like I was afraid the slightest movement might shatter the moment. The house was quiet. The kids were gone. Hannah was gone. And I was standing in the middle of the kitchen, holding the one thing I wasn't supposed to see. I knew I should put the phone down. Walk away and pretend I never saw it. But I didn't. My thumb hovered over the screen for a long time before I gave in. The phone wasn't locked. The messages were there, a thread of text stretching back for weeks. At first, I told myself it could be innocent. But the deeper I scrolled, the more obvious it became. This wasn't a client. This wasn't a friend. It was someone else. The texts were flirty, filled with inside jokes I didn't understand and references to meetings I knew nothing about. There were no names, just that same unrecognized number. I set the phone back down as if it had burned me. By the time Hannah returned home that afternoon, I had convinced myself not to say anything. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe there was an explanation I hadn't thought of. But then she noticed her phone. Her eyes lingered on it a little too long as she slipped it into her pocket. Everything okay? She asked, brushing her hair behind her ear. I forced a smile. Yeah. Fine. She nodded, but I caught the flicker of something in her eyes, like she knew I had seen something. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I listened to the soft sound of her breathing, but my mind wouldn't rest. The text replayed in my head over and over. I needed answers. And I wasn't sure I'd like what I found. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Hannah was still asleep, her phone resting on the nightstand beside her. For a moment, I considered reaching for it again, but something about that felt wrong. Instead, I watched her for a few minutes, studying the peaceful rise and fall of her breathing. I wanted to believe that what I had seen wasn't what it seemed. But the texts hadn't lied. By the time she stirred awake, I was already downstairs, pretending to be busy with breakfast. Morning, Hannah said as she came down the stairs, tying her robe loosely around her waist. Morning. I glanced up from my coffee, keeping my tone light. You left your phone yesterday. Her hand instinctively went to her pocket. Yeah, I realized that when I got to the store. I didn't press it. But the silence that followed felt louder than any argument could have. Hannah poured herself coffee, avoiding my gaze. Busy day today? I asked, trying to sound casual. She sipped her drink, her eyes flicking toward the window. A few projects to wrap up. I nodded slowly, watching her too closely. Meeting anyone? Her head tilted slightly, but she didn't turn toward me. No, just work from home. A small lie. I knew it was a lie because the messages said otherwise. Someone was expecting her. I could feel the gap growing between us, an invisible distance that hadn't been there before. Later that day, while working from home, I found myself fixated on Hannah's behavior. The way she checked her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. How she laughed quietly at messages I wasn't part of. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't focus. The kids would be home from school soon, and Hannah had retreated to the office, door half closed. I passed by it a few times, listening for voices, but there was nothing. Just the soft clacking of her keyboard. I could have let it go. But I didn't. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up our phone bill. A trick I hadn't thought about in years. Scrolling through the list of numbers, I searched for anything unfamiliar. It didn't take long. The same number appeared repeatedly, almost every day for the past month. Sometimes late at night. I copied it down, debating my next move. Finally, I grabbed my phone and dialed. The line rang twice before someone answered. "Hello." A man's voice. I stayed silent, heart pounding. "Hello? Who is this?" Still, I said nothing. After a few seconds, he hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, unsure whether I felt relief or dread. Whoever he was, he didn't know my number. That meant Hannah hadn't told him about me. That should have been reassuring. But it wasn't. When Hannah came downstairs an hour later, I was sitting at the dining table, phone still in hand. She paused when she saw me. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah. Just a bit tired." She smiled, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "Long day?" I almost asked her right then, about the messages, about the man on the other end of the phone. But I held back. Because part of me wanted to see how far this would go. The call haunted me more than I expected. The sound of his voice replayed in my head as if I could dissect it for meaning, something familiar, something I might recognize. But no matter how many times I replayed the conversation, it remained just a voice. That evening, I watched Hannah more closely than ever. She moved around the house gracefully, but there was a tension beneath her calm exterior. I wondered if she sensed that I knew something. At dinner, I decided to test the waters. "I had an odd call today," I said casually, stabbing at my salad with little interest. Hannah glanced up. "Oh? From who?" I shrugged. "Not sure. A wrong number, probably." Her fork hovered in the air just a second longer than it should have before she set it down. "Weird." "Yeah." I looked at her carefully, but she didn't meet my gaze. Instead, she focused on the kids, redirecting the conversation to their school day. Deflection. It was subtle, but I noticed. Later that night, when the kids were in bed, Hannah curled up on the couch beside me as if nothing had changed. She rested her head against my shoulder, flicking through the channels. I could feel her warmth, the weight of her body pressed against mine, but for the first time, I felt like she was miles away. "Mark," she said softly, not looking up from the TV. "Yeah. Is something wrong? You've been quiet all day." I hesitated. "Just a lot on my mind." She shifted, sitting up to face me. Her eyes searched mine, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw guilt flicker behind them. Or was it concern? "You know you can talk to me," she said, reaching for my hand. I almost caved. Almost. But something told me not to. Instead, I squeezed her hand lightly and smiled. "I know. I'm fine." Hannah held my gaze for a second longer before settling back against me. But I didn't miss how her phone, sitting face down on the coffee table, vibrated quietly beneath the hum of the TV. She didn't check it. And somehow, that made me even more suspicious. The next day, I made a decision I never thought I'd make. If Hannah wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. After she left to run errands, I opened her laptop. I wasn't proud of it, but pride felt like a small price to pay for answers. The laptop opened without a password. I hesitated, hovering over the trackpad. At first, I found nothing unusual: emails, design files, invoices from clients. All perfectly normal. Until I checked the second email account. The one I didn't know about. The inbox was mostly empty, but I recognized one name instantly. The same number from the texts. The email thread was short, but every word felt like a hammer against my chest. I can't keep doing this. He's starting to notice. I understand. But I miss you. When can I see you again? I'll let you know. I just need some space right now. The latest message had been sent 2 days ago. Hannah hadn't replied. I leaned back, rubbing my hands over my face. It wasn't just texts. It wasn't just late-night calls. This was bigger than I thought. That night, I watched Hannah carefully. Every smile, every laugh, it all felt rehearsed now. And for the first time in 10 years, I felt like I was living with a stranger. She noticed me staring halfway through the evening. "What?" she asked playfully. I forced a grin. "Just thinking about how lucky I am." Her smile faltered briefly, but she recovered quickly. "Well, that's sweet of you. But I wasn't thinking about how lucky I was. I was thinking about the email sitting in her inbox. The one she didn't know I had read. The email haunted me for days. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The words felt like splinters under my skin, impossible to ignore. He's starting to notice. That was me. I was the he. And yet Hannah moved around our house as if nothing had changed. The worst part was that I didn't know what I wanted to do with the truth. I thought about confronting her 100 times, but something always held me back. Fear, maybe. Fear that I wasn't ready for the full weight of her answer. Or maybe it was hope. Hope that if I didn't say it out loud, it might all just fade away. But things like this don't just fade. The tipping point came on a Wednesday night. I was working late in the home office when I heard Hannah's laughter drifting down the hall. It wasn't loud, just soft, but enough to catch my attention. Curious, I stepped quietly toward the sound. She was in the living room, curled up on the couch with her phone. The screen glowed against her face, and she was smiling at something, or someone. I leaned against the doorframe, watching silently. She hadn't noticed me yet. "Hannah," I called out, making her jump. She fumbled to lock her phone, but I saw the panic flash across her face. "You scared me," she laughed nervously, setting the phone down beside her. I crossed my arms, pretending not to notice. "Who are you talking to?" Her eyes flicked toward the TV. "Oh, no one. Just scrolling through Instagram." "Lie." I forced a nod and turned to walk away. But then, from behind me, her phone buzzed. She reached for it quickly, but not before I caught sight of the name. "Unknown caller." "Work email?" I asked casually. Hannah hesitated. "Yeah." "Client follow-up." Another lie. I returned to the office, shutting the door behind me with more force than necessary. That was it. I couldn't keep pretending. The next morning, Hannah left early for a client meeting, and I found myself alone with too much time to think. I stared at the computer screen, but I couldn't focus. Instead, I opened my phone and redialed the number from the call log. The same unknown number that had appeared again and again. It rang twice. "Hello." The same voice. I stayed silent, letting the silence hang between us. "Hello," the man repeated, sounding more cautious now. I took a breath. "I know who you are." There was a pause, just long enough for me to know I had his full attention. "I think you've got the wrong number," he said, but there was an edge to his voice. "I don't." My voice hardened. "You've been texting my wife. Meeting with her. Don't lie to me." Silence. Finally, he let out a low sigh. "Look, man. I didn't know she was married." "Liar." She told you, I said coldly. I saw the emails. She said she needed space because I was starting to notice. So don't stand there and tell me you didn't know. There was another pause. Then his tone shifted. Fine. I knew, he admitted. But I didn't think it was my place to get in the middle of whatever you two have going on. I clenched my jaw, gripping the phone tighter. Who are you? He hesitated. It's not what you think, Mark. My stomach twisted. How do you know my name? He didn't answer. I felt cold. This wasn't a stranger. He knew me. Who the hell are you? I repeated, my voice rising. Finally, he spoke softly, almost regretfully. I'm Eric. I felt like the air had been knocked from my lungs. Eric. My old coworker. The same Eric I hadn't spoken to in years. The same Eric who had come to our house for dinner once or twice. I remembered Hannah laughing at his jokes, but I never thought twice about it. Until now. I gripped the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. You've been seeing Hannah? I'm sorry, he said, and I could tell from his tone that he meant it. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We ran into each other a few months ago. She said things were complicated at home. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I sat down heavily, the weight of his words pressing down on me. You were my friend, I said quietly. I know, Eric replied. And I regret it. I never wanted to hurt you. I almost laughed at how absurd that sounded. Don't call her again, I said. Don't text. Don't email. If I find out you've been in contact with her, I'll make sure you regret it. Eric didn't argue. I understand. I hung up without another word. When Hannah came home that night, I was waiting for her. She set her purse down, smiling. Hey, you're home early. I didn't smile back. We need to talk. Her face paled, but she nodded. Okay. We sat in the living room, and for a moment, the only sound was the ticking clock on the wall. I know, I said finally. Hannah froze. Know what? I called him. Eric. Her breath hitched, and I saw the truth written across her face. I wanted to hear it from you, I said softly, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. But you didn't tell me. You kept lying. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't speak. Why? I asked. Was it worth it? She wiped her eyes, but the tears kept coming. I didn't plan for it to happen. I swear. But after so many years, I felt invisible. And Eric made me feel like I mattered again. I stood, unable to sit still. You mattered to me. I know, she whispered. And I hate myself for it. We sat there, the weight of her confession hanging between us. Finally, Hannah spoke again. Can we fix this? She asked. I met her gaze, but I didn't answer. I wasn't sure if I could. The room felt suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in around us. Hannah sat across from me on the couch, nervously twisting her wedding ring around her finger. The same ring I had placed there 10 years ago. But now, it felt like a relic of something long past. Her question lingered in the air. Can we fix this? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that this was just a misstep, a lapse in judgment that we could overcome. But the weight in my chest told me otherwise. How long? I finally asked, my voice colder than I intended. Hannah swallowed hard, wiping the corner of her eye. It started about 3 months ago. 3 months. 90 days. 90 days of stolen moments, secret texts, and meetings behind my back. Why Eric? I pressed, leaning forward, elbows on my knees. Of all people, why him? She hesitated, as if she was still searching for the right answer. I don't know. I ran into him by accident at a cafe one day. We talked for a while, and it just escalated. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. That's not good enough, Hannah. People run into old friends all the time. Not everyone decides to cheat. Her eyes filled with guilt, and she lowered her gaze. I didn't wake up one day and decide to ruin everything. It wasn't like that. I could hear the sincerity in her voice, but it didn't make the betrayal sting any less. What did he give you that I couldn't? I asked, the words barely above a whisper. She looked up, her eyes glassy. It wasn't about what he gave me. It was about how I felt. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen, Mark. I felt like someone noticed me again. I sat back, the weight of her words settling like lead in my stomach. I noticed you, Hannah, I said, feeling my voice tremble slightly. Maybe I didn't say it enough, but I did. I always have. I know, she replied softly. And that's the worst part of all of this. It wasn't because you weren't good to me. It was because I lost sight of us, and I let myself fall. Her honesty cut deeper than I expected. We sat in silence for what felt like hours. Eventually, Hannah stood and crossed the room, sitting down beside me. Her hand lightly brushed against mine, but I didn't respond. I'm not going to make excuses, she said quietly. But I'm here. I want to fight for this, for us. I looked at her, searching her face for something, sincerity, regret, love, anything I could hold on to. And I saw all of it. But I also saw fear. She was afraid I'd walk away. The truth was, part of me already had. Over the next few days, we lived in a strange limbo, polite, distant, but fragile. The kids didn't notice anything different, and we kept up the performance. But at night, we lay in bed facing opposite directions, and the space between us felt like a canyon. I didn't call Eric again. But he lingered in the back of my mind like a ghost I couldn't exorcise. One afternoon, while Hannah was at the store, I found myself scrolling through my phone, hovering over his contact. The temptation to send a final message burned inside me, but I stopped myself. What good would it do? The damage was already done. The twist came when I least expected it. A week after Hannah's confession, I opened the front door to find a small envelope resting on the porch. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. I frowned, stepping inside and carefully tearing it open. A single piece of paper slid out. Mark. I thought you should know the full truth. It wasn't just Eric. There's more she hasn't told you. You deserve better. There was no signature. My breath caught in my throat as I reread the note, my heart hammering. Who sent this? And what did they mean by more she hasn't told you? My mind raced, jumping to the worst possible conclusions. Was there someone else? Had Eric not been the only one? The walls around the life I thought I knew started to crumble even further. That evening, I waited for Hannah to return home, the note burning a hole in my pocket. When she walked through the door, smiling like nothing had happened, I knew I couldn't hold back any longer. I held the note up silently, watching her face pale the moment she saw it. Who sent this? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Hannah's lips parted, but no words came out. I'm done with the half-truths, I said sharply. If there's more, you need to tell me now. Because if I find out later, I'm gone. No questions, no second chances. Tears welled in her eyes as she approached me cautiously. There's nothing else, she whispered. I swear. I stuttered her, searching for cracks in her defense. But she held her ground. Then who sent this? I demanded. She shook her head. I don't know. Maybe someone trying to get inside your head. Don't let them, Mark. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes stayed locked on mine. I wanted to believe her. But that note felt like a ticking time bomb I couldn't defuse. Even as we stood there, staring at each other, I realized something unsettling. It wasn't the betrayal that scared me the most. It was the thought that I might never know the full story. The note didn't leave my mind. I carried it with me, folded neatly in my wallet, as if the weight of the words would somehow lead me closer to the truth. But no matter how much I turned it over in my head, no answers came. Hannah tried to act normal in the days that followed. She cooked dinner, helped the kids with homework, laughed at sitcoms we had seen a dozen times before, but I could see the tension behind her eyes. She was waiting. Waiting for me to crack. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat in the kitchen, sipping whiskey in the dim light. Hannah had already turned in for the night, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The note sat on the table in front of me. I pulled out my phone, staring at Eric's number. I hadn't contacted him since our call, but something about the note didn't sit right. If Eric had been the only one involved, why would someone else go out of their way to tell me there was more? I texted him. I need to know if there's anything else you haven't told me. Did Hannah see anyone else? Minutes passed. I watched the screen, waiting for the typing bubbles to appear. Finally, a reply. I don't know, man. I swear. But, if I were you, I'd check her emails. My pulse quickened. I sat there, staring at his words, until the quiet hum of the house felt unbearable. The next morning, while Hannah was showering, I opened her laptop again. I hated myself for it. This wasn't who I wanted to be, the suspicious husband, digging through emails and searching for shadows. But I couldn't stop. I scrolled through her inbox, finding nothing unusual. I clicked through folders, old drafts, even her spam folder, all clean. Until I stumbled across the archives. Hidden under layers of saved files was an old email thread. It wasn't Eric's name that caught my attention. It was Rachel's. My heart pounded as I opened the thread. I appreciate you keeping this between us, Hannah. I know how hard it must be. Mark deserves honesty, but I understand why you're hesitant to tell him. Some truths are better left unsaid. Rachel. The same Rachel I thought had disappeared weeks ago. Another email followed. I think about telling him sometimes. But you're right, it would destroy him. I'll keep your secret, but you owe me for this. I gripped the laptop tighter, scrolling faster. You're the only one who knows the full story. Please don't tell Mark. I'm trying to move on. The messages blurred together. Rachel knew. Rachel knew something I didn't. I shut the laptop with shaky hands. That night, I waited until Hannah had fallen asleep before stepping out onto the porch. The cool air did little to calm me. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Rachel's name. I hadn't spoken to her since our last message exchange. I hesitated, but eventually pressed call. She answered on the third ring. Mark, she asked, her voice cautious. It's late. Is everything okay? No, I said plainly. I found the emails. There was a long pause. You weren't supposed to see those, she said softly. Yeah, I figured, I replied coldly. I want to know what you're hiding. Now. Rachel sighed on the other end. Mark, listen, it's not what you think. Then tell me what it is, Rachel. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been keeping secrets for Hannah. She didn't speak right away. I didn't want to get involved, she admitted. But Hannah was scared. She thought if you found out, it would break you. Found out what? I pressed, feeling my stomach twist. Rachel's voice lowered. It wasn't just Eric. I closed my eyes, exhaling sharply. There was someone else, she said. Before Eric. Last year. My heart pounded so loudly I barely heard the rest of what she said. She ended it before it got serious. But I guess, old habits die hard. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Who was it? Rachel hesitated. You wouldn't know him. That wasn't enough. I needed more. But before I could ask, Rachel's voice softened further. Mark, whatever you decide to do, just remember she's trying to make things right now. I'm not saying it excuses anything, but maybe you shouldn't burn everything down just yet. I hung up, staring at the dark sky above me. Hannah's betrayal ran deeper than I thought. And I wasn't sure if I could climb my way out. The world felt different after Rachel's confession, heavier, colder. I stood on the porch for a long time, staring out into the dark, wondering how many more secrets were buried beneath the life Hannah and I had built. I walked back inside quietly, the house unnervingly still. The faint glow from the living room clock read 2:14 a.m. I climbed the stairs slowly, every step echoing louder than the last. Hannah was asleep when I slipped into bed beside her. Her breathing was soft, peaceful, the kind of sleep that only comes when you believe the worst has passed. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the weight of it all to crush me. But it didn't. And that was almost worse. The next morning, Hannah hummed softly as she poured coffee, completely unaware of the storm lingering just beneath the surface. She kissed me on the cheek as if nothing had changed, and for a brief moment, I almost believed it. But I couldn't unhear Rachel's words. Hannah noticed me watching her as she sat across the kitchen table. You're staring again, she teased, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. What's going on in that head of yours? I smiled faintly, swirling my coffee. Just thinking. About? The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Us, I said honestly. Hannah's smile faltered for a brief second, but she recovered quickly. Well, that's better than work. I studied her carefully, searching for cracks beneath the surface. Do you ever think about telling me something you thought I couldn't handle? I asked, watching for any reaction. Hannah froze, her hand tightening slightly around her cup. What do you mean? She asked, her voice light but careful. I let the silence stretch between us, watching her. Something like that. She met my gaze for a long moment before looking away, focusing too intently on the coffee in front of her. Mark, she began, her voice soft, if this is about Eric. It's not just about Eric, I interrupted gently, holding up the folded note I had kept in my wallet. Her eyes flicked to the paper, and for the first time, I saw real fear behind her mask. I know about the other one, I said quietly. Hannah's face paled, and I saw her grip the edge of the table as if she were bracing for impact. Rachel told me, I added, placing the note down in front of her. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Her eyes stayed fixed on the words, unblinking. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. I ended it, Mark. Before you ever found out. I nodded slowly, though the tightness in my chest didn't ease. That doesn't make it better, Hannah. It just makes it quieter. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time since this began, she looked defeated. I wanted to tell you so many times, she whispered. But every time I looked at you, I couldn't do it. I couldn't risk losing everything. I leaned back, crossing my arms over my chest. And yet, you still did it. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. I don't know why. I can't explain it. It wasn't because I stopped loving you. I just got lost somewhere along the way. We sat in silence, the weight of her words filling every inch of the room. I don't hate you, I said finally, my voice softer than I expected. But I don't know if I trust you anymore. Hannah wiped at her eyes, nodding slowly as if she had expected that answer all along. I don't expect you to, she replied. But I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild that trust. If you give me the chance. I wanted to believe her. But trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It wasn't about words or promises. It was about time, and I wasn't sure if time would be enough. Over the next few weeks, life settled into an uneasy rhythm. Hannah was more attentive, more careful with her words and actions, as if every small gesture might tip the balance. I told myself I was giving her a chance. But part of me couldn't help but wonder if I was just delaying the inevitable. One evening, as I sat alone in the office, I opened my laptop and scrolled through old photos, vacations, family gatherings, birthday parties. In every picture, Hannah was there, smiling beside me. But as I stared at those images, I realized something unsettling. I couldn't tell if the woman in those photos was the same woman who sat across the table from me now, or if she had been someone else all along.